Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers, dear Aditi, it's a big pleasure for me to welcome you to our today's webinar, India and China, Leaders of the Global South, question mark. I would like to highlight. My name is Jos Pachali and I'm heading the Asia division of Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Berlin. With this webinar, we would like to formally launch a web dossier with the same title, which was published some days ago and has already received quite a lot of attention. We are very glad to have some of the main contributors and some of the commentators with us today here, who will share the main points of their papers and are very keen to discuss them with you. The idea for this comparative look came from following the Voice of the Global South Summit in 2023 in Delhi, which was already mentioned in some of the papers, and at the same time, having in mind posters on the streets of Beijing welcoming African leaders to the Chinese capital. Obviously, both India and China present themselves as leaders of the Global South. With this dossier, we would like to dig a bit deeper into the question, what are the motives for these aspirations and do they differ? And we asked as well, how do the countries in the Global South react to it? I would like to thank my colleagues Jochen Luckscheiter from the Delhi office and Artur Tarnowski from the Beijing office of Heinrich Böll Stiftung to take up this idea and fill it with life. Another thanks goes to Joel Sando from the Global Public Policy Institute, who supported this project with his experience and advice, and GPPi is also a partner in this event today. Now, I just would like to quickly introduce the moderator for today's event, which is Aditi Mukund. She is a German Chancellor Fellow at the Humboldt Foundation and based as well at the Global Public Policy Institute here in Berlin. Aditi will introduce the concept and the speakers to you and guide us through the conversation. Thank you, Aditi, for taking up this interesting task. Finally, I wish us all a very fruitful exchange, and I'm very glad that so many people are interested in this topic. With this, I hand over to you, Aditi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joost. A very good morning, afternoon, good evening to all of you joining us today. And on behalf of GPPi and the Heinrich Böll Foundation, let me again extend a warm welcome to all of you. I'm Aditi Mukund, and I have the absolute privilege of moderating this stellar panel. Our speakers will be introduced to you shortly. There is certainly no shortage of discussion on the Global South at the moment. So in our current rapidly evolving world order, you will find this term appearing in policy papers, summit declarations, speeches, and headlines with remarkable frequency, actually. And yet, for all its visibility, it remains a fairly loosely defined and quite politically contested term. This conversation is also taking place at a particularly significant moment. It follows closely on the heels of the Munich Security Conference earlier this month, the recent AI Impact Summit in India, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's visit to China, and just a series of high-level diplomatic engagements across regions in the world today. And so together, these developments underscore how questions of security, governance, and economic alignment and geopolitical competition are increasingly intertwined, and more importantly, how actors in the Global South are very central to these discussions. So I personally believe there's really no better time to be having today's webinar. Our objective for today is therefore to focus on how we can move beyond just rhetoric and examine how leadership claims of the Global South by China and India are imagined, articulated, interpreted, and received, and what this means for global cooperation in an increasingly multipolar world in concrete terms. So we will have an initial round of inputs from all our speakers, followed by a secondary round of questions before moving on to a Q&A interaction with the audience. Speakers, just to make sure we have enough time for the audience interaction, I would ask you to keep your first round of interventions to no more than 6 minutes. To kick us off, we now have Professor Dr. Zha Daojiong, who is a professor at the Institute of International Studies at Peking University in Beijing. Welcome, Professor Zha. And to you, yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to spend my first 6 minutes to answer the first question. In my understanding, how does China articulate leadership claims in the global south? If there is one central word to characterize the motivation, I would argue that it's a demonstration of self-confidence in what China today has achieved, especially in the past, through the past 80 years. But then for the extended understandings are for analysis. I'll quickly go through probably 5 quick points. First is that, as I wrote in the paper, Global South was never in the Chinese vocabulary, but nevertheless, it's possible to trace elements of the same idea. Back in the before the founding of the People's Republic, namely from the transition of the late Qing dynasty through the Republican years, the Global South was very important. It was an ideational or an imagined community. Dr. Sun Yat-sen spoke about all nations being equal or 天下大同. But then in the 50s, through the 70s, the Global South was very much an politically engineered connectivity. You would have Chinese artists performing songs and dances from third world countries, either in Chinese or in learning a Chinese foreign language, and they would be staging shows in China or taking those similar shows in to countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Africa or Latin America. And also during those years, you had exchange of sports events that were Chinese organized that. Those were the low-hanging fruits. And against that context, the so-called ping-pong diplomacy with the United States, which was held in Japan, was considered a big deal. But then also during those years, the Global South was in an exploratory sense, a partner for economic cooperation through development aid. If you look at the Tazara rail line connecting Zambia and Tanzania. So for China, I would think Global South is less a deterritorialized geopolitical or geostrategic construct than it appears to be in some of the northern or western foreign policy contexts. It's part of the Chinese way of reaching out to the rest of the world. But quickly moving to today, the Global Development Initiative, which was announced in the middle of the pandemic, 2021, is the latest effort to relate to the Global South. It's an add-on to the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So the core idea behind this is economic development, is the core in the development cooperation. If you noticed, the GDI has a so-called friend of the GDI group located at the Chinese mission at the United Nations Secretariat. And one of the major developments was September last year, 2025, Prime Minister Li Qiang announced that China will no longer seek access to what's called special and differentiated treatment in the current and the new WTO agreements. And this is a way of demonstrating more than solidarity, because that special and differentiated treatment was heavily in favor of China. Rather, China is not Macedonia. Why would we be asking for the same treatment under the WTO? And so then development continues to be, today is the highlight. But then further on, in terms of development or economic relationships, China continues to practice unilateral concessions on tariffs. If you remember earlier, actually it was just barely 2 weeks ago, President Xi announced that China is going to extend zero tariff treatment to all products from 53 African countries that have diplomatic ties with China, and this zero tariff unilateral concession is going to take place from May 1st this year. And this builds up from an earlier experiment of what's called early harvest in China, negotiations with the Association of Southeast Asian Nation Countries, the ASEAN. From 2003 to 2006, China began to implement zero tariff on agricultural products from ASEAN economies. In the beginning, it was on an experimental basis, ASEAN 6, but later on was extended to ASEAN 10, and then culminating in 2010 when you had a formalized
Right.
free
Professor
trade
Zha,
agreement. Yes.
I will just come in here and thank you for this overview. We will have the chance to pick up some of your points in the next round of questioning. I've noted what you said about the Global South being a politically engineered term to how it goes to moving beyond just demonstrating solidarity. And I will definitely pick up on the concrete examples you mentioned when we come back to you. But we now move on to our second speaker, Professor Ummu Salma Bava. Hi, Professor Bava, welcome. Professor Bava is a professor of European studies with a specialization in foreign and security policy at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Professor Bava, a similar question to you, I guess, is how does India now articulate its claims to leadership in the Global South? What historical narratives and policy tools does it rely on to support these claims?
So good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. And thank you, Aditi, for the question and the introduction. Let me just first say, as you correctly pointed out right in the very beginning, the term Global South means many meanings to depending on which part of geography you occupy or stand. Is it an object of policy, or is it something as a space which decides its own destiny? I think that is important. Two other important points, to frame the question that you've given. One, I think we are looking at a certain geography of the world, even if one may not think of it in that way. Clearly, the vertical division of the North and the South is replaying itself again in the current context, but it's new. It's new because we are looking at a time span in which 80 years after the end of Cold War and 70 years precisely after the Bandung Conference, when the first articulation of aspirations in the Global South, if one were to use that term, which was not in use at that point in time, came forward. And so one would have to ask, what is first, bringing this kind of constellation back into focus again? I think that is important to get through into the discussion. And that obviously is drawing attention to something fracturing or dislocating in the current global order, which has brought attention to the Global South. Now, in this context, if I look at India, then India's pursuit or India's role, if I would put it, is anchored in its own historical experience of colonialism and the absence of being able to voice its concerns at international platform. And what changes in the current iteration where India is stepping forward to take the lead is that India is bringing together multiple factors, the political, the economic, and the socio-cultural connections of the past. But more importantly, I think it is India's growing economic weight, which also strengthens, its aspirations for political leadership, which are being advanced at a time when we do see the fragmentation of the global order, and we definitely see elements of a multipolar order which is coming up. So India's leadership is also aligned with its own values and interest in that sense. And so what is visible is that there are two distinct elements over here. One, India seeks to enhance the collective voice through political engagement. I think this is a very clear statement put out in terms of its foreign policy. That is the collective voice. I think that is what. So I think we have to recognize that leadership there are various kinds of leadership, but when you're looking at what is happening on one side to the fragmentation of the political order, then the question is, who will work to bring collective voice to the forefront? And I think that is one of the singular elements that we are witnessing. And the second aspect which I would talk is about re-envisioning the entire South-South cooperation itself. Now, whether it is the political aspect of it, the economic aspect of it, security elements, and of course, the people-to-people connect. Two good examples from the recent past of the last 3 years, which I draw upon, is the G20 summit in 2023, where India put out, and with the support of all the countries over there, we were able to get a Delhi declaration out, which also meant it also signaled the ability of India to work with all countries on the table. I think that was important. But what also was put out over there was a particular philosophy of Indian philosophy of Vasudev Kutumbakam. The world is one. And I think that is the operating part that we are seeing being integrated into the foreign policy. And the second is the recently concluded, as you alluded to, is the AI summit, which was called the AI Impact Summit. And one of the points which came out where the Prime Minister was talking about was to think of now AI and the internet and what we are constructing now as a global commons. This is a radical way of thinking. It's about creating a human-centric approach to integrating it. So I think I gave these two examples just to emphasize two elements of it. One is the notion of the collective, that is inclusion, and the other is the notion of the horizontal, which is an envisioning cooperation. One can unpack this in the questions as we go along.
Thanks a lot, Professor Bava. So we've heard now a perspective from China and a perspective from India. I would encourage all of you who've joined us today to definitely go through these first two papers that articulate this topic in the dossier that is linked in the chat. And now that we've sort of set the stage with how China views and articulates its claims to leadership in the global South and how India does as well, we're going to try to unpack how these are received in other global South countries. And to that end, allow me to welcome Dr. Cliff Mboya, who is a policy analyst at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg and is joining us today from Nairobi. So Dr. Cliff, how are India and China's leadership claims received in Kenya, and what do these varied approaches reveal about the conditions under which leadership claims gain or lose traction?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Well, I think my presentation focused on the Bandung spirit, and for Africa in general, and in this case, Africa is not homogeneous. Countries have different interests and foreign policies towards these countries. But Kenya in particular is very interesting because we have a strong historical links, particularly with India, in terms of trade and the Indian community here. So that brings some form of solidarity that might be different from other African countries. But to respond directly to your question, these leadership claims are received by their own merits. And this is based on our national interest and our geopolitical space where we find ourselves in both regional and international geopolitics. So the concept of the Global South has been about Afro-Asian solidarity, and that is what drives us as we look at both India and China. And the key thing for us is not about having leaders. It's about having countries that we can work together to pursue the common agenda that is linked with historical inequalities, our space in global governance and our interest in these issues. So we are not trying to replace the global north with the global south countries that would play the same roles, but rather we are looking for countries that we can find space to push our common agenda so that we find space in the global governance, decision making, and policy making. So that is what we are trying to do. But then we're also doing this in an environment of global cooperation, or rather global competition between India and China, and also cooperation in some aspects. So regionally, they might be competing in some other areas because of their own security and economic interests. But then also globally, we see them working together just to try and carve their own space in global governance, which aligns with their rising power and space in the current contemporary geopolitical space. So basically, my answer is they are received by their own merit and what they can offer in terms of that solidarity and cooperation going forward. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cliff. Without losing any steam, I will pose the exact same question to our next speaker, Dr. Marcos Robledo Hoecker, who is a professor of public policy and foreign policy at the University of Chile and is indeed joining us very early in the morning in Santiago. So I think, like I said, it's the exact same question, but from a perspective, from Chile's perspective, which is how are India and China's claims received in Chile, and what do varied responses reveal about the conditions under which this leadership claim is received?
Thank you very much, Aditi. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the Heinrich Böll Stiftung and to thank very much the foundation for this invitation. It could be difficult to find a timely occasion to discuss the topic of the China, India, and the Global South for the first time, because of the first time in the United States-Chilean bilateral relationships on February 20th. The Trump administration punished Chile, imposing visa restriction on 3 Chilean government officials, including 1 minister member of the cabinet, because of a Chinese-Chilean telecommunication project that includes an optical fiber cable between Hong Kong and Valparaiso, the Chilean main port. The project is not approved yet, and the Chilean government responded, reaffirming its right to national sovereign decision-making. However, the final decision is expected to be taken by the new Chilean administration and will take office next March 11th. Beyond its unprecedented feature, the current Chilean-US bilateral crisis is therefore part of the wider regional and global framework in which the questions posed to this webinar take place. The regional context is strongly marked by the renewed and explicit willingness of the United States to impose, by force if necessary, as it happened to Venezuela, effective and exclusive hegemony over Latin America in a broader process of global power reconfiguration, featured by the emergence of new global actors and the erosion of the United States leadership. We don't know how the hegemony of the United States in Latin America will develop in the coming years. In fact, we are facing very open scenarios. But if we adopt a long-term perspective, we can identify some trends which I will try to summarize in 6 points. The first one is that Latin America was the first region to carry out the process of decolonization and independence from European empires and to confront the emergence of imperialism and the hegemony of the United States. As a result of this historical process, since the beginning of the 20th century, Latin American countries organized their foreign policies around a relatively stable set of principles which are common to most of the countries of the Global South. The sovereign equality of states, non-intervention, the peaceful resolution of disputes, a genuine strong support of multilateralism and international cooperation, and a deep substantive adherence to international law as a shield to hegemonic behavior. Since then, the regional goal has been achieving political autonomy and influencing the evolution of the international system. These have been not only words. Among numerous other initiatives, Latin America can play an important role in ensuring that these principles were reflected in the Charter of the United Nations, promoted the early introduction of solidarity and development aid in the UN, and has actively promoted international peace and security, establishing the first nuclear weapon-free zone with the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the first effective zone of peace in the world. In 2004, while it was negotiating the free trade agreement with the US, Chile was the only non-permanent member of the UN Security Council that vetoed the US resolution aiming at the invasion of Iraq. And currently, and despite the critical international conjuncture and reaffirming this commitment with global multilateralism, social justice, peace and security, Chile, Brazil, and Mexico, and promoting former President Michelle Bachelet as the first female United Nations Secretary General. The second point is that both Chile and all Latin American countries have a historical identity that clearly places them in what we understand today as the Global South. That is, countries with a shared historical consciousness and with historical bonds of solidarity that after the decolonization process of the 20th century were expressed in the non-aligned movement. These are bonds that were forged in the head of national liberation struggles and democratization processes during the Cold War. Although they predate the change introduced by globalization, they generated shared identities, sympathies, and deep solidarities that remain in force. Third, the process of globalization has created new links of a structural nature between Latin American countries and the rest of the world, especially China, and increasingly also with India. In this process, which is also similar to other South American countries exporting copper, soy, and other commodities, China became Chile's largest trading partner with and India is currently the world's fifth largest economy and ranks 11th as a partner in Chile's trade. Fourth, while some analysts understand this phase of the crisis as a crisis of the 80 years of liberal international order, from a long-durée perspective, we may also be witnessing a most fundamental restructuring of the global order since the beginning of the modern era. Likely, even according to the OECD, by 2100, the real GDP of the G20 emerging economies will be far bigger than the GDP of the G20 advanced economies, which means that in this process, the dialogue among China, India, and the Global South will be decisive. In this framework, the historical shared identities, values, and goals, together with the new structural realities and interests, are the basis upon which is expected to be a protracted, diverse, complex, and multi-level process of dialogue, exploration, practices, and institutional building. Fifth, most Latin American countries, including Chile, expect the European Union to play an active cooperative role in the reconfiguration of the international order, as even some European authors pose with an hostile US and disappearing transatlantic link. The European Union needs to fully embrace its strategic solitude, seek new partners, and look more and differently at the Global South. It must decide once and for all whether the region will be a peripheral or strategic partner and adopt a more horizontal and egalitarian approach to relationship with the Global South. And sixth and finally, the ongoing hegemonic interregnum is providing particularly challenging for Latin American countries, not only because of the renewed US hegemonic behavior, but also because of the current crisis of Latin American regionalism. It is weakening its position regarding the US, as well as its global dialogue regarding the new international order. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now have our last speaker for the day. Welcome to Manisha Reuter, Deputy Program Director at the Asia Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So just to maybe sum up a few thoughts of what we've heard China and India's leadership claims of the global South, narratives of solidarity woven into creating economic partnerships. We've heard a little bit about how those have been received in Kenya and Chile. On Afro-Asian solidarity, ideas of decolonization and justice, and also, again, a common thread between all four of our previous speakers was the need for better partnerships, really. So coming to you, Manisha, what does then global cooperation in a more multipolar international order mean for Europe? And how should Europe adapt its global South engagement strategies?
Thanks, Aditi. Just a quick disclaimer that I'm still recovering from a cold, so if I'm coughing, apologies in advance. I'm going to keep it very brief in my opening remarks, and then we can go into this a bit more in detail in the discussion. But I think what has become very clear from also previous interventions and from reading the articles in the dossier, which I highly recommend, is that countries across Africa, Latin America, and also Asia are not passive arenas of competition. They are strategic actors, and they're not looking, and I think Dr. Cliff Mboya said this very clearly, they're not looking for a new patron or for a new leadership from be it India or China or the US or Europe. They're comparing offers. And they will make choices, and they will be choosing something today, and they'll be choosing something else tomorrow. So in that sense, and in my paper, I called it the crowded marketplace of partnerships. So in that sense, in the crowded marketplace of partnerships, countries are buyers, and they're shopping for infrastructure, technology, financing, security cooperation, market access, and diplomatic ties. And I think you asked what that means for Europe, and I think essentially it means that it requires a profound mental shift in European engagement with the global South, because it's no secret that the EU has always been among the largest providers of developmental aid, specifically also Germany, where I'm located. So it's not a surprise that the sort of lens that Europe was looking at the global South with was very much focused on development aid for a long time. And then recently, of course, also in sort of what I call defensive geopolitical terms. So countering other people's influence, particularly that of China with initiatives such as the Global Gateway. But the framing no longer works. And when Europe presents itself primarily as a value-based alternative for the global South to countries like China, it risks sounding as if it's asking partners to choose sides in someone else's rivalry. And many governments across the global South have made it very clear that they're not interested in binary choices. Strategic autonomy is a term that is sort of discussed here in Europe very recently, but we don't own this term. It's very much alive in Nairobi, Jakarta, Delhi, beyond. It's not something uniquely European. And there is also a much broader strategic point that I would like to make. And Professor Bava sort of alluded to this in the sort of multipolar world that we are currently seeing. Influence is not accumulated through dominance. And I think that is something we see very clearly also with the example that Professor Hoecker gave about Trump and recent US tariffs. Dominance has its limits. I think the new currency is networks and partnerships. And Europe's strength lies in coalition building. I mean, we see this on an everyday basis. Europe itself is a coalition where, every day in the European Parliament, they will have to negotiate among themselves what to prioritize and how to reconcile certain needs in Spain and France with others in Poland. So flexible issue-based partnerships is actually something that Europe should be very good at, and is what we're used to be doing, rather than having sort of rigid political blocks. So for me, the question is not whether Europe can win over the global South, it's whether Europe can become a preferred partner among the many offers that they are on the table. And if the global South countries are buyers in a crowded marketplace, like I framed it in the beginning, Europe's task is not to warn them about the other vendors, it's to improve its own offer. And because, and I'm sort of end with that one sentence that I'm going to borrow from Mark Carney's speech at Davos, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's something that I don't know why we sort of somehow needed the Canadian Prime Minister to tell us this, but this is something that is really slowly sinking in here in Europe in the last couple of years, but specifically also in the last couple of months, that we need to be at the table and we need to make a good offer in all of these conversations to be an attractive partner. And one very good example that we can sort of see very recently, and it's no secret that I'm specifically also working on India, is the EU-India FTA that was concluded about a month ago. Is, I think, one of the results of that realization that we need a seat at the table and that India is too important for us here in Europe to let go. So I think it's more of a mental shift that is taking place here in Europe and that we're witnessing that is extremely important in our engagement with the Global South. And I'll end here for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for really tying a lot of those threads together and at the same time creating more opportunities for a follow-up discussion on a lot of what we've heard. So I'm going to come back to you now, Professor Zha. You've heard different perspectives from all of the other speakers after your opening remarks. There's a line from your paper that I thought was particularly interesting, in which you say, the true test is how well India and China fit into the template of actions as desired by a country of the Global South and its society, rather than the pursuit of the goal having the other excluded. How does this look realistically, and are there any examples you could give us that sort of speak to what you spelled out in your paper?
Well, I'm not that familiar at all with Indian foreign policy to the Global South countries, but as was mentioned earlier, by our colleague from Nairobi, I would think a lot of this has to do with the inheritance of ideas, standards, and human networks from history. I don't quite like the word diasporic communities, but that's a very important dimension. It's rather for those societies in the Global South to relate to the kind of leadership or policy offers from China or India or anyone else. I like the Manisha's characterization of the marketplace of offers, right? You got the vendors, you got the sellers. So in that sense, I would hesitate to conclude with any kind of characterization of who is winning or who is not winning as much, who being China or India. It seems to me this is a subject that deserves a lot more exploration.
Absolutely. Then I would move on to you, Professor Bava, to see if you have any further thoughts and reactions based on what we've heard from our other speakers and panelists, and to really maybe push some of your previous points on how India could play a stronger role in articulating its vision of the Global South and where these opportunities really lie and with whom.
Thank you. I mean, I think let me take a point what Cliff was saying, that the countries in Africa or even other parts of the world, as Marcus also said, I think one has to reimagine the notion of leadership. We think of it like a triangle and somebody standing at the top holding a flag. And I think the current state of play of the global international order requires cooperation to the utmost. I think we have seen that kind of leading from the front kind of role for the last 70 to 80 years, where it created a pecking order in international politics. I think what you're seeing currently is not only the unraveling of that, but also the pushback from the South. And I think so India's vision in that clearly comes also, like I said, from a historical perspective, but also like looking at engagement. And I said, this is about inclusion and not exclusion, which one has experienced. And it's also recognizing there cannot be a one-size-fit-all solution. And so clearly, engagement is extremely important. Manisha pointed out to the marketplace of partnerships. Partnerships have always been there. The question is, are we seeing a re-strategizing on partnership because the keeper of the global order has decided to stop playing the policeman? And then what does it open? So I think I would divide in 2 points. One, we could look at larger global public goods and what does it mean when some countries obviously will step up and will have to step up. But then global public commons requires the utmost of cooperation to produce the kind of situation or a win-win for all. And the next, of course, is a tier 2 thing, and that would be a more regional kind of an aspect, is that how do countries in different geographies, and for India, then it would be South Asia and the extended region, where will India play a more active role? Because I think we have to recognize that it is still a country which is growing and evolving. The economy is growing. It's not that one immediately has, the capacity to do everything, even as you augment, and build a capability in certain areas, but definitely prioritizing what you can work on. And I think 2 things come over here for me. One, the more recent example of the past, during COVID, where India took the initiative to position itself to supply COVID vaccine in Africa. And this was about, even while we were having severe limitations at home, India said we have to look out. So this was also about sharing knowledge. I think that is extremely important. It's critical that if we are going to address global challenges, how do we produce a consensus of a different kind? I think this is where India is going to work on consensus together and leadership together in a collective. It's not about, like I said, just a single person standing out. And second, I think the recent AI summit is also, again, indicative of how it has been positioned. India says we have to look at the AI as a global commons, and let's work to, even the proposal of a platform called Manav, which means humanity, is to include everybody. Now, the point which you said is, and when you ask Cliff, do countries receive it that way? Obviously, India values its strong established democracy from 1947, the fact that we have invested in institutionalism, we have harnessed technology to provide global, public goods internally in terms of the digital public infrastructure, and one could go on down the list. But one has to recognize that we don't have a uniform political mosaic where every country values the same political values that you stand for. And so, which means even the partners with which you engage may not necessarily value the kind of democracy experience you bring and would look to others. So that's just in terms of just the political part of it. So one may see an easier, I would argue that one may see an easier engagement when it comes to economics, because there is a certain demand and supply rationality to it. Politics is not amenable to that kind of demand and supply of values. It depends on the existing political culture and the ability to build on that. And so I think we are going to see, to borrow Manisha's metaphor of the marketplace, we are going to see the marketplace is full of ideas. And we will see that where different partners are going to find a meeting point. And I think one such very fantastic meeting point which happened just now was the India-EU summit, the 16th, and we got the FTA, and that is of course being highlighted. But two very big other components: we got a security and defense cooperation and a cooperation on mobility. So I think clearly we see what we are witnessing, at least in the mental framework, is the reimagining of the idea of partnership. And that is where I would position the Global South as well. These are not countries just looking for new leaders. And India's approach is also not about, imposing something. India's idea is about working together, not together for a collective. I think that is important.
Thank you. Before I go ahead, I realize that I have been hogging the speakers. So as a reminder to the audience, please feel free to already start posting your questions in the Q&A function. And if you have a specific question for a particular speaker, please mention that as well. We will come to the Q&A in another maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And coming back to our discussion, I'm going to come to you now, Dr. Cliff. Something you said in your opening remarks about how we're looking for countries to find a space and to shape a common agenda and not replacing the global north with the global south. I think that flows really well from what Dr. Bava was saying. So where do you see this space occurring? How do we create it? And what are the items you want to add on this common agenda?
Well, I emphasize the point that from an African perspective, for us, the key issue here is solidarity. And as much as the Global South cooperation is about mostly countries in the developing South, and the narrative has been the Global South vis-a-vis the Global North based on our historical experiences. And we've made considerable gains over time. And I think the issue of agency comes up from that context. And it offers a very important avenue or platform to push this collective agenda, as much as there are aspects of rivalry, which is natural in a marketplace. We might have this solidarity within ourselves, but we also have competition within ourselves. So we need to balance those. But then for me, the key is we must continue to push for a different kind of multilateralism, because that is what brings us together. Because I think it is clear the Global South is not about geography or the emerging geopolitical issues, but I think the Bandung spirit is what holds us together, despite the changing political environments and so forth. So I think emphasis must continue on South-South cooperation, despite rising influence. I think we still face structural inequalities in institutions like the UN Security Council, IMF, World Bank, where decision-making and power still remains skewed towards the developed world. So these efforts must be sustained, and efforts to democratize these institutions and reforms must continue, because there's still resistance on that part. And then if you look at India and China, they present different products. I pointed out that India is very big on the normative aspects, and different countries, some countries will align to that. Countries like Kenya want to be seen to be democratic. We might practice it differently from India, but it's still an attraction. China is very big on material, in terms of investments, partnerships, aid, and things like that. So you find it's also attractive in that sector. So emphasis must be put on that. But the key is you see, China is bringing an alternative, So India seems to be pro-status quo. China appears to be a bit more radical. But then the overriding fact is we are pushing for a different kind of multilateralism because for us in the global south, it has not worked for us. So we are looking for alternatives. So it is still engaging and exploring what else can we do, what can we do differently. And I'm glad that the EU is also taking note and trying to take a different approach. So we're on the right track. And then also want to emphasize that I think we need to strengthen internal cooperation through South-South and triangular cooperation frameworks. We have institutions like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Voice of the Global South Summit. We have ASEAN, we have the African Union, APAD. These regional organizations, they're also very important in coordinating ideas because these ideas are not static, depending on the geopolitical developments, they change. So having these regional organizations or institutions there we can coordinate our voices and ideas, I think those are also very key. And then also related to that, the general thing is we need a coordinated kind of activism on the global scene because now this is about global governance and trying to find our space in it. So that coordination, whether we do it through BRICS and these regional organizations, or we just all run to the global south solidarity movement and try and focus on the common issues and push through our ideas, I think we should focus on those. That is one key area where our agency can be advanced globally.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you mentioned triangular cooperation in particular because we already have a question on that in the chat, which we'll come to shortly. Once again, to our audience, I encourage you to come in with your questions and please do try to mention who you're addressing your question to. Coming to you, Dr. Marcos. Again, to give you an opportunity to react to some of what we've heard very briefly. But in your paper, you also mention your doubts on whether the Global South can effectively articulate and contribute to the creation of a fairer, more democratic multilateral order. And you think that this articulation still remains uncertain. I'd like to maybe ask you to expand on that from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I think the transition to post-Western international order faces several challenges, but perhaps the most important of all for the countries of the Global South is to be able to build an order, eventually a new international structure that is more just, more democratic, and more sustainable than the world order built from the modern era. This means moving from the geopolitical governance and the current geopolitical governance to one that is effectively more democratic and multilateral, and in general, vindicating and incorporating the historical advances that the different cultures and peoples of the Global South and the North have been able to build throughout history. I mentioned a while ago, for example, that Latin American countries reinterpreted the European and Westphalian principles of international law precisely as a strategy against imperial powers. And more recently, over the past century, the international community has collectively and multilaterally created new global principles and regimes that aim to foster international cooperation, peace and security, to protect human rights, gender equality, and more recently, the idea that development must be sustainable or there won't be development at all. However, this is not and will not be an easy task, especially in the historical periods of interregnum in which we have already observed and currently observe the emergence of all kinds of morbid symptoms and monsters in both the North and the South. It would be wrong and very dangerous to believe that we in the South shouldn't don't face the same challenges. So I think this is a very open. I'm eventually. I would like to say that I'm optimistic, but I think given recent history and even older history is, of course, a challenge, and especially because I truly believe that there are no better cultures than others, are all equal. So the challenge is the same for all the cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out to us. I think there's more to discuss in the Q&A as well. And that brings me back to you now, Manisha. We have taken your marketplace metaphor and run with it. And I think it's been pretty useful to help us articulate our different positions in this discussion. In your first remarks, you mentioned maybe Europe needing a bit of a mental shift. What Europe can still bring to the table is coalition building. Now that you've heard more perspectives, how do you see that materializing?
Look, let me make a couple of points on what I think could be done and expanded on from a European perspective. I think we all agree that the European Union is still one of the most attractive trading partners in the world. It's one of the largest trading blocs. It's a leading provider of development finance, and it remains as such, especially as the US is drawing out of that field. Europe is staying committed in various areas. And it is what I often hear as sort of regulatory superpower. That's the term that I hear a lot when sort of I'm traveling to India, for example. And I think initiatives such as the Global Gateway are designed precisely to play on these strengths and to offer high quality infrastructure, partnerships. And the intention is good. The difficulties comes with the implementation. Because credibility today depends less on big announcements and more on delivery. And I think we've seen a world now where countries are increasingly sort of judging us not on promises, but on what we actually deliver. And if we look at the Global South, in many regards, China has delivered, for example, when it comes to infrastructure projects, and quite quickly so. And in this competitive environment, implementation speed and visibility on the ground and financial clarity matter enormously. And I think the EU is still sort of in this process of decreasing its bureaucratic hurdles. And I've heard this feedback a lot when talking to people that, you know, we wanted to apply for this and we wanted to do for but it's very complicated and we don't know exactly, you know, and then things get lost in the process. So I think if we can make things a bit easier to access, that would already help us a lot in engaging with countries, especially because if we don't do this, there are others who will fill the gap. And then the second point I want to make is sort of building on what I said earlier. I think Europe just needs to recalibrate its own narrative. Too often, engagement still carries this sort of implicit hierarchy of Europe as the standard setter and others as the norm taker. And I think in a multipolar order, this is counterproductive. As we heard from Cliff earlier, many countries in the Global South want co-creation, is I think the term you used, and not conditionality-heavy relationships with asymmetries. So this does not mean, and I want to be very explicit about this does not mean abandoning values in principle. It just means embedding them in mutually beneficial projects. And I'll give you an example of sort of how this can be framed. I think one big hurdle also in the relationship with sort of India, with other partners, has been the CBAM discussions and sort of Europe's climate finance partnerships. And I think climate partnerships, for instance, should just not be framed as sort of Europe exporting standards, but as a joint industrial strategy that supports local value creation. Because essentially that is what it could be. And third point I want to make is, and I've sort of already alluded to that, is that Europe just must accept diversification is not something that we just want here in Europe. It's something that everybody's striving for across the globe at the moment. And diversification is going to be a structural feature of the new world order that we currently see emerging. Nobody wants over-reliance on either partner in this marketplace of partnerships. And countries will engage simultaneossly with China's Belt and Road Initiative, India's development partnerships, Gulf countries financing, American security ties, and European trade and regulatory cooperation. So the goal here for Europe cannot be exclusivity, but it has to be relevance. And that means being competitive in areas where Europe has genuine competitive advantages, for example, transparent procurement, sustainable infrastructure standards, regulatory competition as regulatory cooperation, as I mentioned earlier, and that facilitates access to the European market, high quality education networks, free education, I think is something that is often not alluded to enough. And of course, as I mentioned, climate finance instruments that reduce long-term risk of the countries in the global south that are the most vulnerable to climate risks. So I think these are points where I think we can address them here in Europe. We're in the process of addressing them. There are several, and of course, I mean, Cliff said this earlier that Africa is not a homogeneous continent. So is Europe. We often, we hear the EU and we have an EU voice on certain things, but then if you look below the surface, there are, of course, German interests and French interests and Polish interests, and they'll differ. So I think this is a process that is currently undergoing here in Europe and on its way to sort of this mental mindset shift. And those are the three areas where I think we could be making a difference.
Thank you so much, Manisha. I think that's a really good note to end the discussions on. And once again, I encourage all participants and members of the audience to read the fantastic papers that make up the India, China in the Global South dossier. But on that note, it is time to segue into the Q&A part of today's discussion. I'm going to start with a question from Janvi Tripathi, who asks if you could please share your perspectives on what would a practical design for triangular cooperation, so between India, Europe, and a partner country, look like that avoids reactive geopolitics and instead funds co-created projects with a measurable local capability transfer. For example, a climate DPI stack for ports or campuses so that host countries aren't forced to choose between speed, infrastructure, and rules. So, I'm going to come to maybe you first, Cliff, for a brief response, and then we go to Professor Bava and then Dr. Zha.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question, but let me try and respond and you correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's such a difficult question because now you have to be very clear on what Europe wants, what India wants, and the other country. So the issue is not about thinking it beforehand. It's about sitting at the table, like, what is this about? What do you want? What do you want? Because the whole issue about this divide is about inequality, imbalance, and then the historical element, colonization and domination and things like that. So when those are addressed, I think the other things becomes automatic. And I think Manisha has made it very easy for us. When you go to a marketplace, you don't strategize or, like you believe in your product. I have the best product in the market. You go and sit there and wait for your customers to determine. You might have the best product, but they prefer something else that is not necessarily the best. But then in their mind or in their conception, this is the best product that we need. So that is why this whole debate of China being authoritarian, and Europe being leading in terms of values and things does not really apply in this context, because some countries will say, we want development first. We've tried democracy and all these things. It doesn't work. So it should not be too normative or stuck in the mind. It is something very practical. So you just sit and try to be fair. I know as long as you're dealing with governments and those kinds of institutions, national interests will always be there and they will never be the same. So the whole idea is have your product, believe in your product, and believe that you can sell your product.
Okay. Coming to you, Professor Bava, but there's another question in the chat for you, so I'll ask you to try to answer both of the questions at the same time. And this question is from Shikha Sinha, who says, can trade and economic partnerships truly function independently of politics, or are they inevitably influenced and shaped by political interests, even in contemporary democratic systems?
So, I mean, if I come to this second question, obviously trade and economics are very strongly intertwined with politics. I think the whole world saw that as a recent example last year on 2nd of April, as President Trump announced a slew of tariffs across countries around the world, and it was recently taken up by the Supreme Court in the United States, and it said the executive power went beyond and went into congressional jurisdiction. So you clearly see that, politics is always an element of trade and economics, both in the internal dimension and also in the external part. And then, of course, it also comes down to whom do you want to do trade with. I think what we have also seen, and unlike the 40s and 50s, where probably there were lesser actors and less interdependence, we can't get away from the fact that all our choices are going to be increasingly shaped by the power of interdependence, or your inability to disconnect, or even, if I may so as say the word, to de-risk. De-risking is a very nice word, but the reality is far difficult. And it requires, whether it's economics, it requires a lot of investment to produce that kind of a place where countries would say, okay, we will now come and shift manufacturing here. It's not impossible, but it's a function of time. And time is a prerequisite when we see the balance of power shifting. I think that's extremely important to recognize. In terms of the first question of trilateral partnerships, I think we've already seen some efforts towards it. These trilateral partnerships of India with the EU are there, taking place in Africa. Cliff was pointing about how state preferences will shape what they want, and that is extremely important to recognize that while we may use the metaphor of the market is also very ruthless. Let's not forget that. It has a sentiment of its own. And even if something is good, if it decides it does not want it, it can eliminate it. Second, the market comes at a price point. So there's a danger if you look at it from that lens. And if you talk of global South, then isn't the entire gamut of political relations till now one of a price point in relations? And if you're talking of a new repositioning of relations, then it cannot come from a price point. It has to come from equity building, I believe. And I think that is where, when Cliff talks about, the Bandung spirit, it is about the spirit of equity building. It's not about equity for one part of the world, and the rest of the world is a place of experiment. So I think what we are looking, and where India is also, slowly building with the EU and with other trilateral, is to look at projects where it can deliver. Now, Cliff also pointed out about economics and why sometimes, and even Manisha pointed it out, on why, countries would be more inclined to look at getting that infrastructure at whatever it happens. Forget about the normative construct. Sometimes there's the political urgency for the leadership over there. These are choices made by states, right? And when we get a compendium of all the choices, you can't just do a balance sheet analysis and say good or bad. This is also about recognizing that, ultimately, even when you do partnership, there is an agency for every country. And it's a choice about what they want at the end of the day. You may end up sometimes, if it is the metaphor of the market, you will pay the price upfront now, or you will pay the price later on. But if we change that and bring in the idea of equity, fairness, and justice, which is coming a lot from the climate issues, then, I mean, clearly, if EU pushes now for CBAM, then you are imposing a cost on others, which will actually be seen as a non-tariff barrier in our part of the world. And the question then to ask is, are you, is the EU then, it is, yes, the world's largest regulatory, producing machine, but in many parts of the world, the EU is also seen for and known for what is called as regulatory imperialism. So in the current context, what is the messaging? And if we are guided by the spirit of Ubuntu, that we are all in it together, I am because of you, then it has to be solidarity and partnership of a different kind. And trilateral, then I think, will be more selective. It will be also about how you can bring the nuts and bolts of what is the asset on both sides and deliver in a third place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Bava, for that very comprehensive answer. And still opening it up to you, Dr. Zha, in case you had reactions on triangular cooperation.
Well, there have been a good number of projects in terms of triangular cooperation, the EU, China, or before Brexit, Britain, China, and African country or Southeast Asia. And actually, German foundations, including the one that's hosting us, worked on China, Germany, and in Myanmar on certain issues. I myself benefited from participation. Triangular cooperation adds a lot of, let's say, I wouldn't say legitimacy, as a lot of input in terms of ideas, and but sometimes it slows down in terms of delivery of actual benefits, actual project level, tangible results on the ground. But it's still worth going forward, exploring. A different kind of triangular cooperation that's more institutionalized, that both China and India have created special funds in such institutions as the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and a number of others. And those funds would be having a UN-based development institution in China or India, and then a global South country. And let's not forget, there is the Buenos Aires action plan of action. That's the Bava plus 40. But then it's hard to map what exactly the deliverable, because some of these are small scale and they involve small pockets of expertise. But at the end of the day, I would think we have to find a balance between agency, legitimacy, and then the actual deliverables on the ground.
Right. Thank you very much. I'll move on to another question, and maybe combining two questions we have on BRICS. One by Alina Burni, who says, can you share your perspectives on the BRICS and how are India and China leveraging it? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of this grouping for them and the Global South? And another question we have from another attendee is, what uniqueness does India bring to its BRICS presidency, and does it help in influencing global multilateralism? And this is open to any of the speakers. Would anyone like to go first? Professor Bava, maybe because there was a question on India's BRICS presidency, I wonder if I could turn to you.
Yeah, so I mean, this is going to be the 18th BRICS summit. That tells you a lot about the emergence of groupings in international politics. When it began way back, it was in terms of emerging markets and Jim O'Neill's idea of investing in emerging markets, which somehow the political, latched onto it, and it has taken a life of its own since then. from a Western perspective, it is seen as something which challenges the North and the given structures of the North. I think what the BRICS shows, and I think this is also about the idea of inclusion and participation and legitimacy in international order. It also shows the ability of states to create partnerships, right? I think if there is one partnership which stands out in the Western Hemisphere, it would be NATO from 1949. And nobody would question that, right? At least not the West Europeans, or maybe recently, perhaps they've started having doubts about certain provisions of NATO. But I mean, it is interesting also in terms of literature that how ideas in certain geographies don't get questioned. But I mean, when certain other groupings come up, then there's a question of it's not democratic, it's not legitimate. I think I would frame it beyond those two, points and look at what do they convey about the ability to build coalitions, right? That is extremely important. And if it's the 18th iteration, it has also grown. It's not the original founding members. It began as only Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It has grown to include South Africa, and then subsequently now for India, it is operating under the theme of building resilience, innovation, cooperation, and sustainability. And clearly the focus is on the global South priority. So I think each presidency brings their own vision to it. India, if you see, would link it back almost to the G20 summit 2 years back, and it goes back to it. And so India is using the BRICS platform to push for what have come out of the challenges of the last 5 years, I would put it that way. I think probably COVID has shown, that transnational issues are beyond the scope of any single state and any single power. And COVID also showed the nature of the partnership, the resilience of it, our inability to address, for example, at that point in time was public health, which was not a global public good, it appeared, and our inability to share resources. Now, if interdependence is getting, securitized and weaponized, then I think one will have to ask, then how do we then provide for resilience in such a kind of an architecture? And perhaps India in its own way is seeking to address, I wouldn't say all, I think it's just not possible, but in articulating the goals of, and it's a play on the word BRICS. So BRICS over here stands for building, R stands for resilience, I stands for innovation, C for cooperation, and S for sustainability. So the BRICS countries has become the BRICS value, I would say, from India's perspective. It is about solidarity, that word which I think defines what is the notion of, or the value of Global South that Cliff pointed out. It is the Bandung spirit, and the Bandung spirit was for solidarity and cooperation and of equity building for all. That was the spirit. And so perhaps in its own way, India seeks to bring through its leadership the new BRICS, spirit. I would put it at that way.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we'll stick to multilateralism as a theme because I see that in a couple of other questions. And this is from Miriam Price Hansen, who says there has been a lot of mention of the importance of a fairer multilateralism. What is the role of the United Nations? And do you think both China and India are using their leadership position effectively for the Global South in this realm? For instance, in the realm of the Pact of the Future or the UN80 Reform Initiative. Maybe Dr. Marcos, we can hear from you on this particular answer, some thoughts?
Thank you very much for the question. Actually, probably one of the main responsibilities of the Global South in the current international situation is to make a real effort aiming at the strengthening of the United Nations, given the the very important questionings that are arising against the UN and the multilateral idea. I believe that there is a real responsibility to respond for other countries in the world, and especially to the Global South, to strengthen the United Nations in the current international conjuncture. Of course, the agenda for this trail is until now relatively well known, but and includes the tough issues like the reform of the United Nations Security Council, among other issues. But of course, there will not be another place with the level of legitimacy for the international cooperation, for the construction of peace and international security and development, but especially for the exchange of all the cultures in the world and the United Nations. So I think that we are facing a truly historical challenge, because the very idea of the United Nations is being questioned. So I think this is one of the most pressing challenges of today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Marcos. I'm going to come to you now. Manisha, we have a question for you. From a European perspective, are we truly witnessing the rise of a multipolar world, or is this better understood as a renewed form of the US-led dominance within a more fragmented global system?
Tough question. I would say from a European perspective, it's actually both. And I don't see them as sort of mutually exclusive. I think those dynamics are happening at once at the same, well, we see structurally that the global distribution of power is less concentrated than it was in the post-Cold War unipolar moment of US leadership. I mean, very clearly we see the rise of China as a systematic rival to the US. We see strategic assertiveness of Russia, particularly since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but also, of course, with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We see, as we discussed the last hour, the diplomatic weight of middle powers such as India, Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, that comes with certain expectations also to shaping that world order. And of course, we see, as Professor Bava alluded to, the expansion of the BRICS as an important format, and we see these formats emerging sort of everywhere. So clearly, we see, I don't know if it's true multipolarity, but we see a multipolar world forming. And at the same time, if the question is the US still dominant? The answer is yes. In various regards, especially when it comes to security and military and global finance, which is mostly done in dollars still, the US is still sort of the dominant power here, including military alliances such as NATO, technological leadership in semiconductors and AI, and advanced defense technologies, although, I mean, China is, of course, that's what the whole competition is about, right? So I think the short answer is we see both at the same time, and the diplomatic shift from value-based to transactional, I think from a European perspective, that is very, very obvious. If you look at European foreign policy and the rhetoric that was used, in the 90s and the early 2000s was very much on human rights, democratic enlargement, norm diffusion, international law. And what you can see in the last couple of years is a certain realism setting in, especially, I think, after the invasion of Ukraine with, going to the Gulf countries and signing deals for energy because we have cut off ties with Russia, making migration deals with Turkey and North African states, de-risking from China and others. So you definitely see that there's more of a transactional, realistic approach in European foreign policy.
Thank you, Manisha. I think we may now be moving to our very last question for the webinar, and I'd like to come to you, Cliff, because I think there are two questions that are addressed to you that I'm going to try to combine. From Barnaby Dye, who says, I get the sense from Dr. Cliff Mboya and from my own research that Africa cares more about material, that is what it actually gets. And someone else has asked you that you alluded in your opening remarks that while India and China are regionally competitive, they at times present a united front at the global stage. Do you have examples on some instances of India and China maybe working together on this shared agenda at the global stage?
Well, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's true that for Africa's foreign policy, and I think it comes naturally. Most African countries are still underdeveloped, and norms and values, particularly when it comes to democracy, are also important. But then it has come to a point where we have to prioritize, and I think economic issues have become very important. And the truth is, there's been a lot of rhetoric for a very long time, particularly coming from the global north, and when you experience something and it doesn't really work very well, naturally you'll seek alternatives. I'm not saying authoritarianism is the alternative, but I think it reached a point where the African policymakers and the general populations became a bit pessimistic about the whole democratic drive and everything. And there's a feeling that it doesn't deliver tangible results, But then the reality is it's important. There needs to be a balance between this. So I think there was a lot of emphasis on the values rather than actual development, because with the experience of China and other countries, naturally you want to compare and you're thinking, so actually you can also develop through other means. You don't necessarily have to democratize to develop. So those are factors that are real and people feel and see them. So personally, I'll say we need a balance of those, but then we also need to emphasize material gains, because at least we are dealing with countries, they have different values and everything. And you see African leaders also have said that you also need to respect our values. We don't share the same values. So it boils down to mutual respect, equity, and that kind of autonomy. That's why you're seeing alternatives coming in, particularly coming from China. So it's not about comparing which one is best, but what works for us. So it's important also to experiment and explore what those alternatives can offer. And then in terms of, what was the second question again? Sorry.
Was whether you saw any instances or examples of India and China working together to further the Global South leadership agenda.
Oh yeah, I think that becomes very clear in terms of even what you are doing here, the South-South solidarity and coordination. We see China coming up with a lot of initiatives, alternative initiatives. You have the Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiatives, and all those kind of things, just to offer an alternative way, and also insisting on countries having independent development paths. I think that has been very helpful. India also, despite leaning the democratic side and not being very radical, is also playing as a bridge builder, just trying to offer and be a leading voice of the global south. You saw the role that India played in pushing for Africa to have a seat in the G20, for example. Through BRICS, they are able to coordinate the global south voices and project it at the global level in terms of global governance. So I think these countries have played very constructive roles. But then you see a lot of rivalry and competition, particularly in the Indian Ocean region, because of security issues, and that comes naturally because of the nature of international politics. So naturally, they also have to be very selfish and consider their security interests. So as much as they clash there and compete, you see that they try to balance. And it is the same for all countries, whether in the global north or there are areas that you will agree, and there are areas where you might have divergent interests and you need to negotiate and find other ways. So some issues will align and some issues will conflict. You just need to find a balance and see. But when it comes to global south countries, I think that is the direction that we should take. Focus on the issues that we find alignment, particularly climate issues, trade, for example, and global governance. Let us put our ideas together and project one voice. The issue where we have competing interests, we still have time to negotiate and discuss as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now at the end of our webinar. I know there are many unanswered questions, and believe me, I could, speak about this for several more hours, but we do have to let our speakers go. So on that note, thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining this really timely, really important discussion today. I had the really tough task of trying to condense 4.5 pages of notes into maybe 3 takeaways. And I think that while our discussion has underscored that the Global South is not a fixed category, but a very diverse, dynamic space, partnerships are still how we do things, but our idea of partnerships has to change and is changing. There is still appetite for coalitions, but these are probably going to be in very different formats. And there is room to talk about shared values and shared interests at the same time, but we need to find a balance. So if all of you feel like there are still many unanswered questions, a lot of food for thought, and many things to continue to chew on, that is a good thing. This dossier by the Heinrich Böll Foundation and by the Global Public Policy Institute is very much envisioned to be a first step and a starting point, not a conclusion, and we hope it contributes to a more nuanced and grounded conversation. So I invite you all to please reach out to us with your thoughts, with further comments and ideas. And on that note, thank you very much for joining us today. And I wish you a good rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.